Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the Assembly Language Sound series, a series many have described as free and available on YouTube. In part 1, link in the description, we talked about how audio waves are represented digitally, how amplitude gives you the loudness and frequency gives you the pitch, and the shape of the waveform gives you the timbre or the quality of the sound. We also discussed the DAC in the Coco and how it converts digital values into analog voltages that can be sent to various devices like speakers to drive them and make sound. Today we're finally going to write some code. It's an assembly language / basic combo program. It's responsible for initializing the DAC and manually generating a square wave that will go through the DAC and out the speaker. All the code is freely downloadable. Link in the description. And as a bonus, you get to watch me get very surprised and confused. Again. Let's get started. Let's look at some code. Before we can do any sound, we have to tell the hardware we want to enable that 6-bit DAC. To do that, we're going to use 9 lines of code, and I'm showing them in groups of 3. Each group is simply setting or resetting a bit. So here we're going into address FF01, we're resetting bit 3. We're going into FF03 and we're resetting bit 3. And finally, we go into FF23, and we set bit 3. Why? Why are we doing this? If you trace the signal of the DAC, it comes out here, and it goes boop, 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 boop into slot 0, and it's stuck. It ain't going nowhere. You're never going to hear that, unless that selector switch is at position 0. Then that signal can continue and go boop, 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 all the way out the TV. As an aside, you can put that switch in other positions. If it were in position 1, you'd get to hear what's coming in through the cassette. That must be what audio on does. Position 2 allows you to hear what's coming in on cartridge connector 35. Don't know what that's all about. And I guess if you wanted to hear ground, you could go to option 3. I don't know. There's another switch here called switch B, and it does something totally different. It decides what pins of which joysticks are going to end up going into this comparator. But the crazy thing is when you change the position of A, you are simultaneously changing the position of B. So if you're doing work here and you're trying to do sound, you're going to need to be switching back and forth to make sure that the switches are where you want them to be. But luckily for us, I don't care about any of this just yet. This may come back to haunt me. But for now, I'm just going to pay attention to A. The last wrinkle is this other switch here. This is the master switch for A. And when I said that the signal goes boop, 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 boop out the TV, I had to going through this thing. But that wasn't totally correct. It won't go through this thing unless this master switch is also on. So we need to do 2 things. We need to put selector switch A into position 0, and we need to have the master switch on. Only then will our 6-bit DAC be able to come out the TV. These 6 lines of code are all about that first part, setting selector switch A to position 0. So let's try to understand how that does that. There are 2 selector switches, A and B, and they each have 4 settings, but they're not independent of each other. So whatever setting you pick for A, that's the same setting you're going to pick for B. So we really have exactly 4 choices. In order to send the appropriate signal to this selector switch to get things to be how we want, we're going to use the peripheral interface adapter because it is the Swiss Army knife of doing all kinds of things. These are our 4 switch positions, And we're showing over here what those switch positions will do. We're interested here in the 6-bit DAC, so we're interested in switch position 0. The way we control this is with the PA1, the peripheral interface adapter number 1. There are two signals that come out of it, a CB2 and a CA2. And just to be clear, this A and this B are not this A and this B. They're totally separate concepts. CA2 and CB2 are just bits, so each of these only has two options. And so this little truth table here shows you how those two options become the switch position. So all we got to do is figure out how to change the CB2 and CA2 signals on PA1, so we can get them both to be 0 and turn on the 6-bit DAC. So in a previous video on interrupts, I talked about one of the control registers on one of the peripheral interface adapters, so you can control the different aspects of the interrupt. I never talked about bits 3, 4, and 5, and those are the bits we're going to be concerned with today. Any given control register will be in charge of one of the signals coming out of the PIA. And bit 5, if we set it to 1, means that we're going to configure that signal as an output. This is what we want because we're going to output that signal into the selector switch. When we set bit 4 to 1, that says that whatever bit 3 is set to will be the value of the signal. And that leaves bit 3 for us to set to be whatever we want. So if we want to send out a 0, we set bit 3 to 0. If we want to send out a 1, we set bit 3 to be 1. Now, of course, there are two of these we're concerned with because we're concerned with both the CA2 signal and the CB2 signal. So we're using control register A and control register B from the PA1. And these are their addresses. So we just need to make sure that bits 5 and 4 are set to 1, and then we can set bits 3 to be whichever value we want to send. And we want to send 0 because two zeros make a switch position of 0, which gives us the DAC. And that is why we set bit 3 to be 0 on FFO1 and FFO3. Bits 4 and 5 are already 1. The boot up sequence ensures that for us. And so all we need to do is to set bit 3 to 0 on both of them. And finally, these last three lines are about the master select switch and ensuring that that's turned on. And the story there is very similar. In this case, we're now talking with PIA2 and the control register B, because the CB2 signal is what decides whether the master switch is on or off. So once again, at this address, we want 5 and 4, bits 5 and 4 to be 1. And bit 3 can be whatever we want. So to turn on that master switch, we ensure that there's a 1 in that slot. If we want to mute all the sound of the TV, we can just set bit 3 to be 0, and no matter what sound source we've selected, it will be muted. But in this case, as we're initializing our program, we ensure that bit 3 is set to 1. And there you have it, 9 lines of code that do nothing but get us ready to do something. Let's take a quick tour through the rest of the code to see what it's going to do, and then we're going to run it on a real Coco. So up here, we're setting up the interface between BASIC and assembly. So we're going to be driven by BASIC. BASIC is going to call us, and they're going to pass something called a frequency hold as the parameter to this user-defined function. BASIC is also going to poke a couple values here to tell us how long to play that sound. So each execution of the user-defined function plays a single sound, and BASIC gets to control all the parameters. So this is the subroutine that BASIC will call. And the first thing we do is we grab the frequency hold parameter, we stick it here in memory. We call that code that we looked at before to initialize the DAC. And then finally, we load X with the 2-byte value that was poked by BASIC to tell us how long to play the sound for. Our loop is basically two things. Play the high half of the square wave, then play the low half of the square wave. The way we talk to the DAC is through the PIA, through FF20. FF20 is data register A on PIA2, and we're only going to be concerned with the bits from 2 through 7. So the upper 6 bits of data register A are the bits that go into the DAC. So we're going to leave the bottom 2 bits always 0. So when we play the high half, we set all of those 6 bits all to 1, send it out through the PIA to the DAC, and then we loop for however long that frequency hold parameter is. That loop is extremely simple. We just load the Y register with the frequency hold. We keep decrementing it and looping, decrementing and looping until it hits 0, then we return. So the frequency hold parameter, the bigger it is, the longer we're going to pause, which means the longer that half of the square wave will be, which means it will actually be fat. A high value here makes a fat wave, and so it's actually going to have a low frequency. So this is kind of the opposite of frequency. The frequency hold, the bigger it gets, the fatter the wave gets, and so the lower its frequency. A very small frequency hold will do this very quickly, and so we'll get a narrow wave, a skinny wave, and that will be a higher frequency. But whatever it is, we're just going to loop however long that is, and then we do the same thing while playing the low half of the square wave. Finally, because that will happen so fast and our listener will barely have been able to hear anything, we're going to repeat that whole process. So this whole thing is in its own loop. And that loop is governed by x, which we loaded up with the duration value that BASIC poked in. So this won't change the frequency, but this will just tell us how long we get to hear that sound for. And when we're all done, we turn off the sound by going into the sound off subroutine. And all that does is it goes back to the master select switch and it sticks a 0 in CB2. That turns off the master switch without actually changing what the selector switches A and B were set to. So it will still be set to the 6-bit DAC, but it won't matter because we're turning off the sound anyway. And here is the test BASIC program that will call that. We make sure everything at 4000 and greater is reserved. We load our code. We set our defined user function to be there at 4000. And then we loop through reading the parameters. So I put parameters here in these data statements, and they're in groups of 3. Frequency hold, duration high, and duration low. We read them all at a time. If frequency is 0, that's our signal that we're done, and so we end. And then we go to this subroutine to actually use those parameters to call into assembly language. And then we repeat. Go back up here and read the next triplet. So the subroutine will just print the parameters. It will poke the duration high and duration low and calls the user-defined function with the frequency hold as the parameter. So let's take a look at the data that we're going to be hearing. I'm going from high to low, meaning the frequency hold will be very big, meaning the wave will be very fat, meaning the frequency will be very low. So we're going to have a very low pitch sound and another low pitch sound. And then they keep getting a little bit higher, a little bit higher. Once we get into here, where I have the durations at 100, it's almost starting to sound like musical tones. And then once we get up here, the pitch is very, very high, not very musical. And you'll see I've used radically different durations. Okay, let's run the code on my real Coco 2. This is not an emulator. The first 6 sounds you're going to hear are a very low frequency. They're not very musical at all. In fact, they're so low you can hear the individual pulses of sound. Pay attention to the pattern of how it putters and how the puttering grows in frequency as we go from sound to sound. The next several sounds are a bit more musical, they're a bit more in that range. I want you to think about 3 things while you listen to these. The first is the durations are always 100, but is it true that the length of the sounds really are the same? Next, pay attention to how the frequency hold number changes from sound to sound, and how the pitch sounds like it changes from sound to sound. Do you think from the change in the frequency hold number that it's a predictable change in the pitch, or is it not very simply predictable? And finally, pay attention to the quality of the sound, the timbre. Does this sound like the same kind of sound you would get from BASIC when you do the play and the sound commands, or does it sound different? For the last few sounds, you'll notice that we're changing the high order byte of the duration. So you would expect them to last very long compared to the others, but they don't. Also, as a word of warning, they are very high pitched. So I'm going to give you a little countdown, and when we hit 0, just be ready for some fairly unpleasant sounds. You might want to turn the volume down if you're sensitive to such things. Let's talk about some of those questions that I raised before. Does the duration determine the length of the sound? And the answer is not alone. So the duration loop tells us how many times we repeat those sides of the square wave. But the frequency hold tells us how long each side of that square wave is going to be. So a very long hold will make a very wide wave, and it takes longer to listen and to play to a wide wave. So that's why as the frequency hold got smaller and smaller, I had to increase the duration so that you could hear it at roughly a reasonable listening length. And the second question is, what is really the relationship between the frequency hold and the actual musical pitch of the note? Would it be the case, for example, that if I double the frequency hold, then I will go down by an octave or go down by half or something? And the answer is it's just not that simple. How long does a cycle take? Well, the frequency hold plays a factor there, but so does the length of this instruction. So does the length of this instruction and this instruction and this instruction. And if you go into the frequency hold subroutine, certainly the greater the frequency hold, the more times we go through this loop, but there are other instructions going on here as well. So it isn't a direct proportion between the frequency hold and the actual time we spend playing the wave, because of all these other instructions that kind of get in the way and mess up our math. So when we want to tune these notes to actual real musical notes, we're going to have to do something a lot more precise. And finally was a question about timbre. Let's take a look. I've recorded the sound from the Coco into Cakewalk so we could take a look at what the waveform looks like. One of the things I'm curious about is how similar it is to the waveform I captured when I just used the play command. Because I had thought play uses sine waves, and I know that I'm using square waves, or at least trying to, so it's curious to see how it actually looks visually. So the first super low frequency waves are like this. You literally just see these pulses. The very first sound, you may recall, had a duration of 5, so that means that we would do an up pulse and a down pulse 5 times. And here you can see it looks like a down first. I'm not really sure what's going on here, but down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. So that 5 makes sense. I don't get this. So I would expect it to be up for the whole frequency hold, then down for the whole frequency hold, then up. This is weird. I can't explain this. I don't know what's going on. If we move on to the next one, it's really the same picture. It's just closer together because the frequency hold is shorter. But again, it keeps going back down to the 0 line rather than staying up and coming down. I don't get it. A little bit closer together, a little bit closer together, a little bit closer together. Now we're starting to see a bit of a shape. Does not look like a square wave to me. I honestly don't understand. A little closer together. I mean, it's starting to look a little bit square, but that pulse in the middle, I don't understand. I don't get it. Is there a bug in my code? See, now I can kind of see more of that square shape, and then some, so that line at the top, line at the bottom, but the slanting, it's kind of like there's this decay that's built in. Now it looks a little bit more square. Very square. Remember, it's the same code. The only thing that's different are those wait loops and the overall repetition loop. So like a little bit of a step function going up and down, up and down. Oh, geez. I can't really make heads or tails of this. Someone help me! My Coco is old, and I do have to admit I'm not 100% sure that the Coco is still operating at peak efficiency and to spec. So I reran the code through MAME, and I recorded the output from MAME just to see if the shapes of the waves are similar. Generally speaking, when it comes to sound, I haven't found the emulators to be perfect. They're pretty good, but sometimes I hear a lot of extra static and stuff, and maybe it has to do with the very precise timing you need to get sound to sound right. That's why I wanted to use my real Coco for all this stuff, but now I have doubts. So let's take a look and see what MAME did. Yeah, it's the same and it's different. So you expect to see 5 lines up here and 5 lines down here. One thing I notice is it starts on an up. It goes up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. My Coco did the reverse. I don't know who's right, but I can tell you I did expect to see a square wave. I didn't expect to see this spike and then a decay down to 0 and then a spike down and then a decay back up to 0. I didn't expect this, and this is like what my Coco gave me. It's reversed from what my Coco gave me, and it seems, is it closer together or am I just not zoomed in as much? I don't know, I didn't get such a beautiful curvy shape from my Coco. I got like some pretty ugly spikes that went all the way down. Okay. So moving on, this one was a little higher frequency. Very curvy. All right, let's see what we get here. Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, the Coco did something kind of rough and like real worldy, and this looks more perfect. It's not what I expected, because we do have this decay, and we do have this decay coming up here. But it looks very regular. And as we go to higher and higher frequencies, more and more like a square wave, I gotta say. That's pretty square. That's more like what I expected. Let's see what we look like all the way at the end here. It's crazy. Jeez, man. I mean, this is all the same frequency. But look at this. I don't know if maybe this is just imperfections of a connection from the output of MAME into the mixer and then back out to Cakewalk. I mean, these are such tiny jumps. There could maybe just be imperfections with the sampling rate. I don't know. But man, this is really, everything is a surprise to me. Well, as you can see, I ended things a bit confused. The Coco was doing one thing, MAME was doing another thing, and neither was what I expected. I don't think this will necessarily affect what I have planned to do later, but if you have any insight into what's going on, I would love to hear about it. In part 3, we're going to learn how to much more precisely tune these sounds so that we get actual musical notes with predictable frequencies, and it's going to be pretty cool. In the meantime, I'm going to try to sleep at night amidst all of this sonic ambiguity. As a reminder, all of the code you've seen today is available freely to download. Link in the description. Thank you for watching.